My name is Heba, and I'm here to interview Jackie Stuart at the Holland View Trail Retirement Center on November the 29th, 2014. Hi, Jackie.
Oh, it's very good to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So, how long have you lived in Aurora?
Well, I've only lived here since 1984, but I began working here in 1980, and the job seemed to keep me here most of the time. So sometimes I feel I've lived here since 1980.
Wow, so where do you work?
Well, I worked at the Aurora Museum, which no longer exists, at least not in quite the same format. I hope by the time this film is seen by somebody, there will be a new Aurora Museum. But the Aurora Historical Society operated the Aurora Museum, and I was its first paid staff member, and so that's where I worked.
So, is that what brought you to Aurora, the job?
Absolutely, yes, yes. With a little bit of something else. I mean, first of all, it was a job, but a bonus was that my father was born here in town and grew up here. So even though I really didn't know Aurora at all, I felt as though I had secondhand roots here. The job was great. That was the number one thing. But to have that family connection as well, really, that made it a perfect place for me.
Sorry. So, what inspired you to work at the Aurora Historical Society?
Are you prepared for a long story? In my first career, I worked in special libraries. That is not public libraries, not academic libraries, but libraries attached to businesses. In fact, I usually worked for civil engineers. I have no engineering background, no scientific background at all. So it came to a point where I was wanting to be involved with something, you might say, where I knew what was going on. You know, I could provide people with information of all sorts about engineering, building bridges or whatever, but I really didn't know how to do it. So I don't know, maybe having a bit of a midlife crisis or something, a little bit early. And so I was looking for a second career. One day one summer of 1979, I guess, I went on a walking tour in downtown Toronto. And I really enjoyed it. Masses of people, must have been 300 people on the tour. So well organized, it was great. Got home, said to my sister, wouldn't it be wonderful to earn a living doing that sort of thing? 10 minutes later, she phones me and says, have you seen an advertisement for a course being offered at Seneca College in historical/natural interpretation? No. Well, to cut a long story just a little bit shorter, by the end of that summer, I was enrolled in the course at Seneca, given up my first career. So I spent 2 years at Seneca learning about 1,800 different sorts of ferns, which I can't remember one of those things now, but also about talking to people about historical buildings, histories of places and so on, doing the interpretation part mainly, but also about running small museums in particular. And so when I finished that course, that coincided with the opening up of this job in Aurora. One of the co-directors of the course was John McIntyre, who happened to have spent all his life in Aurora and be very active in the Aurora Historical Society. So everything fell into place, and I took that job and been here ever since.
Wow.
I can't remember what your question was, but anyway,
I think you
rattled
definitely
on
answered
a bit.
So how long have you been at the Aurora Historical Society?
Well, it seemed like a good idea to join the society if they were going to employ me. You know, it seemed like the polite thing to do. So I joined the society, I guess, in 1980. I worked for the society and the town combined during the summer of 1980. But I didn't actually begin working at the museum until 1981. But I joined the society in 1980.
And do you still work there or not anymore?
No, I retired back in 2006. There were big changes coming, and I was a couple of years early. I was 63, I guess. Yes, so I could have worked another couple of years. But as I say, there were changes anticipated. As it turned out, not the changes that we've been looking to, but so it seemed a good time to leave. Also, my mother happened to be quite ill and needed some assistance at home. But let a new person come in who could see the museum through all these changes. As I say, it didn't quite work out that way, but that was why I retired then.
I see. So what do you think are like some very interesting stories about Aurora?
Oh.
During your time over here?
During my time, gosh. Well, I guess like anyone who's lived in Aurora for more than about 10 years, sort of the number one thing that comes to your mind, I think, is it's grown so much. So even in that time, which may seem like a long time to a young person, but to me doesn't seem all that long, since 1980, say, Aurora has grown so much. But of course, the history is still there, and as every day that goes by, a little bit more history is being added. History doesn't have to be 100 years ago. It can be yesterday. It's all part of the big story. I'm not sure that I can think of any one great big thing that happened during that time that, ask me 24 hours from now and maybe I will have thought of it. But right now, I can't think of any one big thing that happened during that time. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Do you maybe what was the biggest change in Aurora since you came here?
Well, I guess the growth, certainly. And I remember once talking to somebody, a neighbor of mine at the time, and referring to, I think it was Connaught, street named Connaught, which is on the east side of Yonge. And this person who had lived in Aurora for 20 years, I think, didn't know where Connaught was. And I was thinking to myself, that's shameful. How can you live in the town and not know where this street is? Today, put me east of Bayview, I don't know any of the streets over there. I might know some of the names, but I don't know where they are. And I think that's true for a lot of people in Aurora now. There are so many new parts of town that if you have no occasion to go there, if you don't have friends there or whatever, you might not know. And those areas of town too tend to be largely residential or commercial. So all the umpteen plazas along Bayview, and then on either side lots of housing. If you're going to a store, you don't need to go through the housing, and vice versa. So the fact that there are great big chunks of town that I don't know is a regret to me. I'm not sure what I can do about it except drive up and down, memorizing street names or something. But that certainly is a change, and again, it's just reflective of the huge growth of Aurora over those years.
I believe Aurora was very small before. So is there a certain place that you like to go to, or maybe a restaurant?
A hangout, sort of. No, not especially. Something that in one way hasn't changed and another has is the public library. Still in the center of town, although here we are in 2014, and there are little whispers and, maybes and little bits of chit-chat about perhaps opening up another branch of the library and so on. But as it is, new library building, certainly replacing the building that was here when I first came to town, but still in the center of town, and that is definitely a favorite place of mine. Not that I go and sit there in the comfy chairs and so on, but just go, get to know the staff, spend a lot of time reading old Aurora banners on microfilm or digitized versions, which I have been known to have to kind of pinch myself to wake up if I'm looking for something. It just goes by and by on the screen. But I still see the library as, even though it's a new building, very much of as one of the hearts of town anyway.
Definitely.
You do see people there, and I'm always so pleased, especially on a weekend if I go in, and the place is packed with people of all ages. Sadly, I think not all using printed matter, using computers and their own gadgets of one sort or another and so on. And obviously some people, students working on projects together, and it's just so great to see the library being so heavily used, even in this high-tech age. Yeah. So not sure that's quite the sort of place you meant in your question, but
totally,
but that's an important place.
So was like the library very important for lots of people?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. It could be these days that a fairly small proportion of people actually borrow books. I'm not sure of that, but I could believe that. But of course, you can get your e-reader book now through the library, and read it at home on your own device and that sort of thing. And people use all the electronic databases that are available through the library. Some of those you can use from home. It's I think public libraries in general probably are to be congratulated in how well they've kept pace with changing times and needs and technology and so on, to go on providing wonderful service. And they're not paying me anything to say this. It's true.
Were there like many schools in Aurora when you were here?
There were already quite a few schools, certainly in Aurora, but quite a number added since then. Not only in the public and Catholic school systems, but privately operated schools as well. At one point, there seemed to be a Montessori school about every other block. I think that number has been rationalized a bit now. And of course, the oldest of our private schools, St. Andrew's College, going back a very long way, back to the 1920s. Its own history goes farther back than that, but in Aurora's it's the 1920s. In the old days at the museum, this is being, as you said at the beginning, this is being taped in November, and by now we would have started our Christmas programs for schools at the museum. So kids would come either from walking, a few schools within walking distance of the museum, which I should say was in what I still think of as Church Street School. It's currently the Aurora Cultural Center on Church Street. So that's where the museum was, up on the second floor. So by this time of year, we would be very busy with school visits for special Christmas programs.
Was there something like the children loved to see in the museums, like something that interested them?
Well, don't tell anyone this, all right? This is sort of confidential, but I think it was not so much for the children or adults, for that matter. Well, no, we'll stick to the children. Not so much seeing the old things, but getting involved in activities which were enjoyable to them, but which secretly informed them of things that went on in the past, you know. And then when they saw the old things somehow brought into those activities, then they really enjoyed it, I think. Coming in and walking around and just looking at the old stuff is not enough, as every museum knows. You have to excite people's, whatever the age, you have to excite their interest in some other way as well.
I know you said that you came here in 1980 and
Yes.
your father was also here. Did you also start your family in Aurora, or?
I have no family. My family's all Aurora. Oh, no. No, I'm not married, have no children, and I've been known to say, you know, sometimes teachers would say to me, "Oh, you're so good with the kids," and I'd say, "Well, thank you," but I'd be thinking, "But I know they're going to be gone in an hour, so it doesn't matter how rotten they are, you know." Most were not, of course. Most are delightful children.
Did you have siblings?
I did. I have a sister who very kindly is, we share a house, and she's kindly allowing us to go on living in Aurora because Aurora is so close to my heart. I mean, it's close to hers as well, but it's really for me. I have brothers, but they never lived in Aurora.
So are there any stories about Aurora that you've learned while working at the Aurora Historical Society or at the museum?
Well, a great many, and of course, can I think of any really, really fascinating ones right now? You know, I suppose it's we often think of people first. Okay, what interesting people have lived here? None. No, that's not true. Of course, interesting people have lived here. I'm thinking back not all that far, in two ways. We're doing this at the very end of November, back on Remembrance Day. A few people mentioned a man called Lloyd Chadburn, young fellow, lived in Aurora, grew up in Toronto and Oshawa, but came to Aurora as a high school student, I think. Was not academically inclined. Went off back to Oshawa, I think, to work on cars for a while. But his mother lived here, and she operated a tourist home, which is today would be called a bed and breakfast on Yonge Street. Very fine old house. Anyway, Lloyd Chadburn, once the Second World War began, signed up to join the Air Force and became a top-notch pilot, and became known across Canada. The fact that he was extremely good-looking did not hurt. The fact that he became very well known. And it seemed whenever he came home on leave, which wasn't all that often, you know, he was sent off by the government to go across the country raising funds. People could buy savings bonds to help the war effort, and he'd be off touring doing that and so on. And not long before the end of the war, he was killed in a flying accident, it seems. It wasn't actually in battle in the air. It was an accident, which is, well, it doesn't matter how he died, it's still extremely unfortunate. And of course, he was only one of thousands and thousands. But that's one interesting person. He was a charmer for sure. Other interesting people. Well, the Historical Society now is really based at Hillary House, and a lot has been written about the first owner of Hillary House, Dr. Geeky, who became an extremely well-known, not so much a physician, but as an administrator and teacher of young doctors, ran medical school. A lot has been written about the first Dr. Hillary to live there, and his son, the second Dr. Hillary, and the Hillary family. But the second person to live there, so between Dr. Geeky and Dr. Hillary, Dr. Strange. Since I've retired, I've done a huge amount of research into his life because nobody had written about it. Well, one day I'll go into print about the wild and woolly life to Dr. Strange. Lady killer. One of his obituaries said his domestic life was very unorthodox. So I'll just leave that hanging. Dr. Strange, his strange life. Other interesting things, goodness. And another interesting person, thinking how I often say to myself or to others, I know more people in the Aurora Cemetery than I do walking alive around the streets, you know. And there's one very distinctive, well, there's several, but one of the distinctive markers in the Aurora Cemetery is that marking the grave of a man called John Bowser, or Jack Bowser as he was often known, and his grave markers in the shape of the Empire State Building in New York City, because he was the superintendent of construction of that very famous building when it was built back in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Brought the job in under budget and on time, and for his pains, I think was given a silver tea service, just what every man needs, of course. Lovely tray and all the bits and pieces and stuff. He was paid for the job, but I often wish I knew if he'd got an actual cash bonus for doing his job so well, which I'm sure he would have appreciated more than the silver tea service. Now that tea service was given to the Historical Society for the museum. Everything in the museum went to the town, but I have my doubts that that service was the one given to him because it's not engraved. Sorry, I'm rattling on here.
No, totally
but
fine.
John Bowser, he was born in Aurora, more or less where St. Mac's School is, St. Maximilian Kolbe School is now. Little house there. Ran away when he was 11 years old to seek fame and fortune, or because he couldn't get on with his parents, or who knows what, but he ran away and landed on his feet. Got involved in the construction business, eventually down into the States, and worked elsewhere in the world though, and was employed by the firm that constructed the Empire State Building. But as I say, he did other things too, but eventually came back to Aurora and temporarily took over the business of his brother-in-law, a man called Browning, who was ill. Well, Mr. Browning never did take the business back. John Bowser went on with it, became the Aurora Building Company, and he's built houses and shops and factories and so on all over Aurora and Newmarket, and as well as the Empire State Building. So, quite a story behind that one monument in the cemetery, and not everyone would notice that it is shaped and it's to scale. It's very precise, like the Empire State Building. But once they know that, why here in Aurora? And that's the story.
Wow.
Other people though, or events. I mean, there are some events that Aurora has enjoyed or suffered, depending on the nature of the event, that most small towns have, and sometimes those have had the same impact in every small town. For instance, I'm thinking in the past, especially, but goodness knows we know it can happen today as well. There were a number of very serious fires on Yonge Street. The worst was in the 1880s, when pretty well all of the west side of the business block of Yonge Street, that is from Wellington down to Tyler Street was burned out. Terrible loss. No one was killed, thank goodness. But a terrible loss to the people who owned the buildings, people who rented buildings for their shops, people who lived up above the shops, and so on and so on. And many a town had that sort of fire, days of wooden buildings. Even a brick building will burn if the roof collapses. But in Aurora, as in other towns, that led to the construction of a proper water system, so that it was easier to fight fires. Didn't have to get water out of big tanks that had been let down into the street, covered up with boards. You had a more or less constant flow of water. And that happened in many another town. And of course, that water supply was not just for fighting fires. In fact, usually it was for providing water in people's homes, businesses, and so on. So that was a huge event in Aurora's past, and one that was shared by many places. In fact, there used to be listings in the Toronto papers about fires in the province, and there would always be a few listed. Other big events.
Before I retired, when I knew I was going to retire, I kept a list, an actual written list, of things I wanted to spend more time finding out about, whether it was people or some little question of why does the street have a jog in it or whatever. And practically the day after I did retire, I began looking up the things on that list, and I guess usually I could find the answers. Oh, this is good, and I recorded the answer, took it, filed it away, because I was still doing some volunteer work in the museum even after I retired. But this isn't very interesting to other people. But there were some questions I couldn't answer, and we'll never be able to answer unless we get very lucky. Those are big questions. Like, we talk about the first settlers at Aurora, and we know their names, and we know little bits and pieces about them. But we don't know what was going on in their heads. Were they thinking, oh, thank goodness, I've got a fairly cheap farm, it's going to take me forever to clear it, and so on, but I've got my piece of land now, or okay, I've got my fairly cheap farm, I'm going to clear just enough, and then I'm going to sell it at fast profit, and I'm going to move on to another place because I'm a frontier type guy. But for the people who stayed, were they people who were thinking, gosh, we're the beginning of a new town here, and someday people will look back on us as the founders of this place, which wasn't even called Aurora at that point. Or were they just going from day to day? Oh, good, at last we have a post office. Oh, good, now we have 2 general stores that we can choose from, And I suspect that was the case. They just did their work on their farm or wherever they worked, however they earned a living. But I'd like to be in the minds of those pioneers, I think.
For sure, yeah.
Another big question, there's a well-known person in Aurora's early days by the name of Richard, and I'll just spell his surname, Machelll. There's a street named after him in Aurora, runs parallel with Yonge, 1 block west of Yonge, running north from Wellington. Some people who live on that street call it Machel. Some people call it Machel. Some family members call it Michelle. All these things. I want to know how Richard Machel, that's how I always think of it. I want to know how Richard Machel pronounced his name. At one point, he owned 3 of the 4 corners of Yonge and Wellington. So, not surprisingly, the town had the unofficial name of Machel's, or Machel's, or Michelle's, or whatever corners. He was reeve of the, well, then village council, which is a bit like being mayor, at least a couple of times. He had a big, important general store at the southeast corner of Yonge and Wellington, so he was an important man in town, and I want to know how he pronounced his name. Now, I know people, because I sent off a letter to all the people in the telephone directory for the little village in Yorkshire in England where he came from, who had the same surname, and I said, how do you pronounce your surname? And they all said, to rhyme with the woman's name of Rachel. So, Machel. So, oh, good, I'll stick with that one. But I know not everyone does. And he had a plan of subdividing some of his property up into smaller building lots. And the surveyor put on the plan Match, like M-A-T-C-H, Matchville. So I'm thinking maybe he actually said Matchel, and that the surveyor just misspelled it. So I don't know. So that's one of the big questions, but not really. I'd like to know what Aurora's first school looked like. We have no pictures of the first school. We don't even have pictures of the school which immediately preceded the Church Street School, as we call it now, on Church Street, which was built in 1886 or finished in 1886. There was a brick school there before that. We have no pictures of that. Very sadly, in 2014, we lost the Aurora United Church building by a horrible, horrible fire. Now, there is something good, well, bad, but there's a big event since I've lived here, very recently. Anyway, so that church building was erected 1873, 1874, something like that. We have no picture of the previous building. We have one picture that shows the entrance with a Sunday school class sitting on the steps, and you can see the front door and about a foot all the way around the door, and that's it. And you feel sure that somewhere out there are photographs, even going back that far. There are pictures. But yes, thinking about that United Church fire in April of 2014, horrible event, and that I think drew the town together in a kind of sad way, in a way. I remember it was a lovely day, lovely April morning after a really bad winter, and people were out. You didn't have to put on your boots because there was no snow or ice on the ground. It was fairly mild, and the word got round. Somebody phoned me and said, United Church is on fire. No. It'll be just some little thing at the back, and went out onto Yonge Street. I just live a block from Yonge and a couple of blocks south of the site of the church, and the street was crowded with people, and many of them had no connection to the United Church, but were feeling heartbroken to see this very old landmark in town just burn away. And every effort, of course, was made to save it, but there came a point when you knew it was not going to be saved. It was a bit standing by the end of that day, but the word soon came out that it wasn't stable, and the whole thing would have to be torn down. So that was a terrible day, and I know 50 years from now, people will look back and say, oh yeah, that must have been bad. Turn the page, move on to the next thing. But for the people who are, even people like me who have no connection to that church, who were standing there watching, it was horrible, horrible.
Yeah, especially because it's been in Aurora for so long.
That's right. And people said at the time, well, the church is not the building, it's the people, it's the belief, and so on and so on, which is all true, but the building's important too. So, cool. Maybe I can think of something happy. Sure I can.
I know the Christmas parade always happens every year in Aurora, so when you came here, or did it go then as well?
It did, although when I first came here in the 1980s, I think it was a big event, popular event, and so on. But I think, and its history went back a little. Well, if you go back to, I guess it was pre-World War One, even. Yes, pre-World War One. No, not a Christmas or Santa Claus parade in Aurora, but what used to be called Eaton's Santa Claus parade. Now, of course, today even the Timothy Eaton store, T. Eaton store, means nothing to younger people, but it was a huge department store, like Hudson's Bay Company or whatever today, in downtown Toronto, and family owned, Eaton family, of course. And they started the Santa Claus parade. Not sure where it began, maybe in Newmarket. Took 2 days. They went all the way down Yonge Street to Toronto. Had to stop overnight because it was all on foot. Had real reindeer and people on the floats, throwing out goodies to the kiddies, candy and so on. Of course, nowadays children wouldn't be allowed to eat that candy that came from goodness knows where, even though it was wrapped. So that was a huge event and went through Aurora. Well, then they stopped doing that. It was crazy. They did a much shorter parade just in the city of Toronto. So I'm not sure actually when the Aurora Santa Claus parade was started. Maybe in the 50s, 1950s, perhaps. So it was popular, but when I came to Aurora in the 1980s, it was still very popular. But I think what really gave it a big boost was deciding to have it at night.
Yeah.
It just added that certain something. Of course, you had floats lighted up and so on. That was really that was a good move, and I think has paid off well. And thinking of seeing that parade on Yonge Street reminds me of something else. A very kind of commercial moment in a way, nothing much to do with the Historical Society or the museum, except that it's all part of Aurora's history, of course. And that was the first of the street sales held in, whenever it's held, May, June, can't even think. So sponsored by the Aurora Chamber of Commerce, and with both sides of the street from, well, nowadays I think it's from Wellington down to maybe to Murray. So people setting up their booths, selling this, that, or talking about this and so on. That first sale, to be standing in the middle of Yonge Street and no cars, and the street absolutely packed with people that whole distance. That was quite a moment. I mean, it continues to be amazing, a really successful event, but that first event, and I cannot, off the top of my head, remember when it was. I'm thinking maybe late-ish 1990s, but that was a big event and continues to be.